Well, we know that oil and water don't mix, but that's just an observation. Science usually tries to understand why, try to explain what we see. And so we want to explain the chemical basis for oil and water not mixing by talking about polar and non-polar bonds. We'll throw ionic bonds in there too, because it really helps us understand chemically what's going on inside the cell. Let's take a look. Let's start with a very quick review of the periodic table and some of the chemical properties. We talked about electronegativity increasing as we moved up and to the right, which meant that the elements over here tended to form positively charged ions. The ones over here, negatively charged ions. The ones on the far right just don't react. The ones in this area tend to form covalent bonds. And the rest, these guys are metals, and so they form metallic bonds, which we really don't get into in biology. I'll start off by saying we're going to talk about polar and nonpolar. And those are covalent bonds, but I want to start with the ionic bonds. Remember, that's when two ions with an opposite charge, a positively charged ion and a negatively charged ion, are held together by the attractive forces because opposites attract. Classic example of that is sodium is usually positively charged. It easily gives up that outer electron. Chlorine is happy to accept it. This positive and negative ion are held together as a salt. You also get something like calcium chloride. But calcium has a 2+ charge, and so it can bond with more than one chloride ion. All right, well, that's ionic bonds. What about covalent bonds? Remember, that's when they share electrons. So something like a carbon and a carbon, and we symbolize that with this single line, indicating they're sharing a pair of electrons between the two. And that is a covalent bond. It holds those two together. When those electrons are shared, they circulate around each of the atoms themselves and hold the two together. And in this case, since both carbons are identical, they're going to share that electron equally. And that's going to form a non-polar covalent bond. So that non-polar bond means that there's really not a difference between this side over here and this side over here. There's not a difference between the two carbons. What would make a difference between those two? Well, let's say instead of two carbons, you had a carbon sharing its electrons with an oxygen. Again, there's that electron pair in there. And this time, when they share those pairs of electrons, since oxygen is more electronegative, then it tends to hold those electrons a little bit longer. It's like two kids that don't share real evenly. One kind of takes 2 turns, while the other one gets 1. And you can see the density of this red line that those electrons are spending a little more time over here, leaving it negatively charged. It's not a full negative charge like this ion over here. It's partial, which we designate with this delta symbol, which must mean that this area over here is partially lacking electrons and so has a somewhat positive charge. Since there's a difference between this side and this side, the carbon and the oxygen, then that molecule is polar, right? It has poles, kind of like the Earth has a north pole and a south pole. The two ends are different. That's the idea of polar. All right, so this is polar. What other types of things would be polar? Usually anything with an oxygen is going to be polar, but the same would be true of nitrogen. So if we had a nitrogen-hydrogen bond, that forms a bit of a polar bond as well. Electrons tend to accumulate over by the nitrogen. An oxygen-hydrogen bond would as well. with that oxygen being somewhat negative. This is very commonly seen in water, where you have an oxygen bound to these two hydrogens, and so the oxygen ends up being partially negative, and both hydrogens have a partial positive charge. And so that entire molecule we say is a polar molecule because this end ends up being somewhat negatively charged, where the other two ends are somewhat positively charged. And this is obviously really important in the body, since most of the body is made of water, then that means most of the components of the body are polar. This also, make a little side note here, sets us up to talk about hydrogen bonding. But I'm going to save that for a different lecture and come back to it, just kind of leaving a little bookmark in it here. What else would be nonpolar? Well, obviously anything with two identical atoms, right? So molecular oxygen, O2, is two oxygens, and even though they both pull on electrons more than carbon does, they're going to end up sharing those electrons equally between them. Anything with carbon and hydrogen also tends to be nonpolar. So that gives us a good enough basis for understanding polar versus nonpolar. And then the last thing I'll leave you with on this slide is to say that there's a real chemical dividing line between the nonpolar world and everything else, right? So the nonpolar is things like oils and other heavy solvents that we've talked about before, like paint thinner, gasoline, strong alcohols, things like that. Water is polar, and so are most of the other substances that dissolve in the body, including ionic compounds. These ions really like to get along with water. That's why it dissolves it so well. So this negatively charged chlorine can hang out with the positively charged hydrogen. There's a bit of an attraction there. The positively charged sodium can hang out with the somewhat negatively charged oxygen. So everything on the left side kind of gets along. That's why when you do cooking in the kitchen, you dissolve most things in water. And again, this is the basis for a lot of important chemistry in the cell, where that cell membrane forms a barrier between the polar environment outside the cell and the polar environment inside the cell. Well, let's try to apply these concepts and categorize molecules as either polar or nonpolar. So you're going to look at the chemical bonds, and here already I'm seeing a lot of oxygen-hydrogen bonds, carbon-oxygen bonds. Those are both polar. More oxygen, more oxygen. There's a lot of oxygen in this thing, which means, what do you think, polar or nonpolar? Yeah, that one's going to be solidly polar. That's glucose, and we know that sugar dissolves in water. There you go. Let's try another one. What about this one? We're not worrying about what they are right now. I see some oxygen in here, a little bit more here, and a little more here. But by and large, there is a lot of carbon and hydrogen in there and over here. So what do we think, polar or nonpolar? Yeah, that one's definitely nonpolar. So that's a triglyceride. That would be what would make up oils. Let's try another one. What about this one down here? Well, here's our nitrogen-hydrogen bonds. We have a lot of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen there as well. And so that one, well, there is also quite a bit of carbon and hydrogen down here. A little tougher, but overall, that one would end up dissolving in water. That's an amino acid. Let's try another one. Well, there's water, just shown a little bit differently than the other ones. And we know that one is polar. All right, last one. Ooh, that's a big guy. What can we make of that? Well, I'm seeing lots and lots and lots of carbon and hydrogen down here, kind of overwhelming amount. More of it in here. But then I have this weird phosphate group with a charge on that oxygen. So where does that thing go? Well, actually, it's going to stay right where it is. It's a molecule that's a bit schizophrenic in a way. This phosphate with the charge is polar, so it hangs out with water and other molecules like that. The rest of this is very nonpolar, and so it's going to want to hang out with other oils. And these phospholipids are an important part of our cell membranes, but that's the chemistry behind them. I want to wrap up with just a little bit of chemistry and talk about some other terms that you'll hear applied to polar molecules. And one is that substances here are water-soluble, which means they just dissolve in water. And another term you'll hear applied there is hydrophilic. So obviously the hydro part refers to the water, and phil refers to love, like Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. So hydrophilic, water loving, kind of all saying the same thing. And we have similar terms that apply to nonpolar. We have fat-soluble, so obviously dissolves in fats or oils. And we could also say that it is hydrophobic. So hydro referring to water, and phobic being fearful of something, like you have a phobia about that one. So there you go. That's why oil and water don't mix. Now this has a lot of biological application, from why certain substances can easily move into the cells and others are shielded from the cells, and even how hormones work. Some hormones are fat soluble, others are water soluble, and that's going to have a big effect on how they act in the body. Until next time, keep enjoying life.